Vitorino. I am Brazilian and the leading researcher of the Brazilian Center of Studies in Law and Religion. Today we are hosting this panel with Mr. Ibrahim Salama, Michael Wiener, and Thiago Alves Pinto, who is going to be the moderator of this session. And we are very happy to have you all here from different parts of the world. There are lots of Brazilians, but people from almost all continents. So we are very happy for that. And we wish you a very good session and discussions on the topic Faith for Rights, the role of religions in promoting human rights. After this session, we are going to have a lecture with Mark Hill, and then paper presentations according to our program that you could see in our website. So thank you very much. And Thiago, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and all the team supporting this event, Sarah and everyone else. Boa tarde aos brasileiros. So my name is Thiago Alves Pinto, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm not important, so I'll go directly to the panelists. Michael Wiener. Michael is Human Rights Officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. And Ibrahim is the chief of the Human Rights Treaties branch at the same office. You can read their profiles, and I highly recommend you to read that instead of me reading that, and then they need to pretend not to be proud of all their achievements. So they have like spectacular careers. Go and check. Like I know Michael for 10 years or so, Ibrahim more recently, and yeah, I really admire both of them. So do have a look. It's online. It's on the UFU webpage. And the structure of this event, just before we start, it will start with some questions that I'll make to the panelists. Then I'll move into a Q&A. After that, we're going to be divided into breakout rooms to have a discussion, like a more kind of dialogical session based on one of the cases that you have received. Some of you might prefer to discuss that in English, and then there will be a room to discuss that in English, and the other rooms will be in Portuguese. And then we will, at the end, reconvene and discuss in plenary the findings of the case. And yeah, we want to hear your thoughts about the case and about this presentation as well. So thank you very much, Michael and Ibrahim, for accepting to be a part of this panel. It really is a pleasure to have you at this event. And the first question is, why did you decide to start the Faith for Right project?
Thank you, Thiago and Rodrigo, for this opportunity. Please note that it's an opportunity for learning for us as well, because since we first started this journey of trying to reconcile religions and human rights, we were always aware of the complexities, sensitivities, because the history of religions per se, and religions and politics, and under politics, I bring human rights as an emerging discipline to rationalize politics and limit politics by law. The relationship has always been conflictual. in the past, and a subject of manipulation in the present as well. So we are not out of the complexity. I think it even gets worse, unfortunately. Violent extremism is one of the manifestations, but it's not the only one. Religious extremism, in a way, is a populism, political populism, transplanted in the sphere of faith, which is even more dangerous, because among politicians, at least you can disagree, but when it comes to pretending to or claiming that the divinity or the sacred nature of the source of what you are invoking, it becomes much more complicated, and the manipulation level gets dangerously higher than ever. So that's the main motivation, is that instead of two disciplines conflicting on a number of issues increasingly, instead of religions becoming manipulated as a tool for conflict, as an ideology for violence, we rather tried through this initiative to analyze the commonalities, the convergences, and try to separate them away, and then to zoom on the areas of tension. It all started with our observation, Michael and I, among other colleagues in the Office of the Director of Human Rights, to the fact that whenever religions comes to the discourse of rights, there is tension. One simple example is reservations in the name of religion to international treaties. Another one is the famous resolution on defamation of religions, which divided the human rights community for long. More generally, it is relativism and cultural and religious particularities as one of the cornerstones of the Consensus of Vienna, which is the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action of 1993, which created the Office of the High Commissioner, which is the strategic framework, so to speak, of the human rights work at the United Nations. It has a famous paragraph 5 that I invite you to read, which is a perfect example of the self-claimed constructive ambiguity, when it says that human rights should respect religious and cultural particularities, but these particularities cannot undermine human rights. So be my guest in trying to understand this circular argument. This is no less the challenge that we try to do by unpacking the commonalities on one hand and the tensions on the other hand. Over to you.
Michael, do you have anything else to add to that?
Many thanks. And I just in the chat box pasted precisely this famous paragraph 5 that Ibrahim was just mentioning. So there you can see the famous reference to the universal, indivisible, and interdependent and interrelated rights. But then precisely as Ibrahim was mentioning, the reference to the national and regional particularities, and also the various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds that need to be borne in mind. But then the core point, obviously, is that regardless of political, economic, and cultural systems, that's the duty of states to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So I think that, in a nice one long sentence, puts it in a nutshell. But as Ibrahim was rightly referring to, there has been really for decades a perceived antagonism between religions and rights. So the overarching idea of faith for rights is precisely to reconcile these two areas and really to have both of them strive as far as possible. And I think what you may have seen at the outset with this audiovisual journey through the 18 commitments on faith for rights, this may have already, through the music and through the quotes from the various faith actors, but also through each of these 18 tweet length commitments, that may have given you really a flavor of what was discussed not only 4 years ago in Beirut, which led to this adoption of the Beirut Declaration and 18 commitments on faith for rights, but it's really honing into the fundamental problems of really how to live together and to have both spheres, human rights and faith, equally protected. And perhaps the last point, you may ask, why is it faith and not religion? And here again, the Beirut Declaration gives the answer, because religion in itself as a term is referring only to religious beliefs, whereas you have not only theistic believers, but there may also be atheistic believers or non-theistic or any other believers who are all equally protected under international human rights law, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration and also Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we deliberately asked and had obviously also humanists and secularists, atheists participating in Beirut. And the term that ultimately everyone was fine as capturing also their beliefs, even if they are atheistic or non-theistic, would be precisely to have the term faith. So that's the reason why it's called faith for rights and not religions for rights.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. I think both answers were very comprehensive, and it's really interesting how people read this paragraph 5 of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and just the first sentence, and then go deeper into that. And a lot of times it becomes a mantra, but it's not really taken seriously. And when you dive into the recognition of regional particularities, historical, cultural, and religious background, it makes the first sentence a lot more important, but also challenging. And that leads to my second question. So when you decided to spearhead this project, what were the challenges that you found in bringing this idea, which is like, I think everyone would agree it's sensible and should be simple, but to make that a real project, I'm sure you face some challenges. So can you tell us some of the difficulties you encountered, some of the gaps as well, in terms of research or in terms of infrastructure that could be needed to address these issues of faith and rights together?
I believe there are two. I don't know if Michael from his recollection will add some or not. What methodology to approach such a complex topic? And the second one, with which partners? Who speaks for religions? And an anecdote that Michael will remember vividly is that we stayed in my office something like 2-3 hours fighting with some of our partners, not to name the partner who were involved in the organization of the meeting, because that person, with all my due respect, insisted to have the classical everybody who is working in the field. For us, we needed very specific features. For example, we decided at the outset that institutions, because probably unlike religion, which calls to mind an institution, faith is individual. So we didn't want to involve institutions. Even the signatories to the 18 commitments willingly accepted to decline their institutional affiliations. It's by their own name. So that was the first way out, not just a cosmetic or a diplomatic bypassing, but we decide that when it comes to faith, it's individual convictions, and freedom of conscience is absolute. So no representativity, no institutional representativity is allowed. At least those are the parameters we put for ourselves. So it's only individuals, and then we needed individuals who are interdisciplinary to some extent, i.e. they know things about religion and about human rights. And this begs the issue of religious literacy and in the human rights sphere, and human rights literacy in the religious sphere. So we needed the seed, the beacon of the initiators of the initiative to be people who have a minimum knowledge of each other, because that's what is missing most. And then we decided that's for the parties. On the methodology, I always call it the double convergence. We tried first to identify the blocks of concepts that are common among all faith traditions, and then to compare this bulk of values with the human rights values, without any legalistic adherence to the legalistic side of the norms, the meanings, the values, unpacking the values, to identify the shared ground between all faith traditions combined and human rights. And that led us, again, on the methodology, and when you have just a glance to the 18 commitments, probably the first thing that will be striking for somebody who is familiar with UN documents is that this is the first UN document that quotes religious scripts. And not one, not two, not three, all of them, according to the large definition of religion or belief, as Michael just mentioned. So the methodology was to define what's common and work on what's common, and then devise peer-to-peer learning methodology that would help using these convergence elements to limit the tensions, but not to negate the tensions. One of the main principles is that we should not aspire to identification totally, nor to hierarchization, putting hierarchical order in religions and rights. They are parallel spheres that aspire to the same objectives through different means, and that's why their natural relationship is the opposite of what is reality. Their natural relationship is mutual enforcement, not manipulation and not tensions. But I'm sure Michael can say more about, in particular, this also the tool, because it's one thing to have yet another declaration or set of commitments, which are very result-oriented, by the way, because it always says we, signatories or participants to this document, pledge to do 1, 2, 3. So it's not an enunciation of concepts or legal standards as much as it is to specific actions. Over to you.
Perhaps just to add and zoom out to your question, to respond by a real story. You may remember the Downing Street spin doctor Alastair Campbell when Tony Blair was the UK Prime Minister, and he was asked in an interview about his Christian faith, and he was about to start answering, and then Alastair Campbell jumped in and said, "I'm sorry, we don't do God." That was the famous interjection. And I like also, we don't do God. I mean, this terminology, it's not, we don't talk about religion, we don't do God. That was his terminology. And I'm saying this as a, real but slightly funny story to illustrate a real dilemma that secular institutions, states, but also international organizations have found themselves in. So for decades, there has been quite some reluctance also in the United Nations system in engaging with religious leaders, with faith-based actors. Some of these concerns are actually well-founded, so you don't want to undermine, for example, also human rights by making some actors even more prominent than they are and with related problems. But I think, and if we go back into the history, it's interesting that in the really early years also of the United Nations, you had quite a significant engagement by secretary generals, by the various agencies with faith-based actors. I mean, also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was shaped to a good degree also from faith-based civil society organizations. Even Article 18 of the Universal Declaration really was shaped by that. So I think over the last decade or so, there has been quite a shift at the national, but also at the international levels in favor of really engaging more with faith-based actors at the humanitarian level, on the human rights level, very much operational also. I mean, you see whenever there's a natural disaster, it's predominantly faith actors and humanitarian organizations who are either already embedded or who can really quickly move, and who also have a completely different possibility of persuasion. And just to zoom into gender equality commitment number 5, which is explicitly, and I'm picking up what Ibrahim was just saying, referring not only to non-discrimination, gender equality, but also to address harmful stereotypes and practices and gender-based violence, including, for example, female genital mutilation, child and early marriages. And here you can see the enormous role, either positively or negatively, that religious leaders can have. For example, if a religious leader says female genital mutilation has nothing to do with the Quran, the Bible, or whatever other religious text, this has a completely different value compared to minister or a UN official saying precisely the same words. So I think here again, the idea is to bring the two spheres together and also enlarge both equally. And what Ibrahim was alluding to, for example, this gender commitment, gender equality commitment, has various religious quotes from the Talmud, from the Quran, from Hadith, from Guru Granth Sahib, so from a Sikh, from Abdul Baha. So it's not only the Abrahamic religions of the book, but it's also other smaller religions. And finally, there's also a joint general comment by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Committee on the Rights of the Child on eliminating harmful practices. So again, it shows that there are tension zones, as Ibrahim was rightly saying, but they can also be very much brought together if you speak together and if you reflect and become aware of the similar approaches and ideas, both in the faith and in the rights perspective.
Excellent. So based on what both of you said, it differs at least in 2 substantial points from interreligious dialogue. You're not avoiding tension, that's one. So I think a lot of times in interreligious dialogue is like, let's focus on the commonality and ignore the problems. And the second, you accept women, which also religious dialogue often doesn't. It's just a lot of men with different hats talking about how to determine the fate of the faithful. So as you said, gender equality plays and other human rights play a significant role in defining the 18 commitments. Could you guide us and explain a little bit more of the content of these 18 commitments?
Precisely, Thiago, I think the main feature, the common source of all 18 commitments is what you just articulated very well. Focus on the tensions, real or perceived, and not just try to cover up for them under a general banner of dialogue. And we exactly do the opposite of this general trend, which could be useful to absorb tensions at crisis times from time to time, but it certainly doesn't advance in reality on the ground in a sustainable manner. And that's why we thought of this commitment as 18 areas where there is controversy. So we're not keen to show the good side of the story. We're much more eager to unpack the tensions. So the 18 commitments, and I think it was Michael in an exercise in Morocco who implemented one of the exercises of tweeting among youth. And I'm looking at the tweet size summary of these 18 commitments. They captured them in a tweet, but also in one word for each of the 18 commitments. So commitment 1 is freedom of conscience. Commitment 2 is definition of religion, the large definition as Michael just outlined. Commitment 3 is this is the interpretation, the issue of interpretation. That interpretation is that religions are sect, that interpretations is not. It's human interpretations. Commitment number 4 is the misuse of notions like secularism, Michael alluded to, and state religion as well. How these can be among the sources of tension. It's common notions we use, but they're very dangerous, both of them, unless properly taken and reduced and delimited. The whole idea is that human rights provides tools to rationalize some freely sponsored concepts in the religious sphere. Commitment 5 is one of the most compelling in terms of tensions. It's about ensuring gender equality and finding the roots in faith traditions to this, and dispelling through enlightened interpretations any doctrine that would expose women to violence or establish a hierarchy in rights between men and women. 6 is minorities, minority rights. 7 is hate speech. Commitment 8 is monitoring, self-monitoring of the interpretations in an action-oriented manner. Commitment 9 is the judging of people's faith, takfir, or outlawing, or considering somebody, putting judgmental value on others' faith as something that should be prohibited because of the absolute nature of freedom of conscience. Commitment 10 is about the political manipulation of religions. Where is it a free source for political discourse, and where this should stop, which is one of the most complex, I have to confess. It's one of the commitments where we unpacking the tensions only show us more tensions. And that's why it's I don't think it's a smart solution out of the problem to say we don't have answers to all the questions. I think it's a fact of life. But at least what participants who articulated these commitments are providing are tools to manage tensions, tools to manage diversity, depending if you want to look at it negatively or positively. 11 is critical thinking in the religious sphere, and the protection that should be allowed, and that theology cannot justify everything. 12 is the curriculums of religious teaching and specific commitments in this area to review them. 13 is the role of youth. 14 is the humanitarian aid as a particular area where manipulation and pressures are likely to be high. 15 is exploitation of people in vulnerable situations. 16 is optimization and leverage of the spiritual weight of faith traditions as a human rights defense as well. 17 is partnerships. Why do we need to work on an interfaith basis? I mean, the whole intellectual and operational construct of the faithful rights framework is interreligious. 18 is technology and this debate. How can technology be a bridge and a tool to popularize and to enlarge the scope of the reflection on this matter in a time of social media? This is particularly a double-edged sword. It gives us enormous possibilities, but it also exposes us to many dangers. And Michael can say more about this with concrete examples about recent cases on hate speech in the social media that reach the highest level of political and religious authorities. So these are the 18 areas of tension in a way that we are trying to transform into 18 areas of commitment. Some of them are more conclusive than others in terms of what do they commit to. In other areas, they commit to continue scratching the surfaces, not the surface. Over to you.
And perhaps just to add, and picking up the initial point that you, Thiago, made about interreligious dialogue, which you're absolutely right, has some pitfalls if it's not done in a, for example, human rights compliant manner. We have also seen examples where, for example, the participation of a specific group in a state-sponsored interreligious dialogue was made dependent on them basically joining a mainstream religion. So there was a theological conflict within two basically communities, and the state saw as the only solution to it basically to tell the small community, please join the big community, and then we don't have any problems on the religious side, which obviously is very problematic from a freedom of religion or belief perspective. So the point of departure is precisely not to have yet another talk shop, not to have only photo opportunities for religious leaders who, as you mentioned rightly, tend to be men, and usually old men. So there, the idea was precisely to make it very practical, action-oriented, grassroots, youth, women, girls, to really be inclusive, not only religious leaders, but faith actors. So from any lay member and young person in a congregation, and also really to be very practical and hands-on when it comes to activities where people could come together and make contributions together when it comes to humanitarian aid or solving a long-standing conflict. And I mean, just to give you a concrete recent example also of our UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which looked into hate speech incidents over the last year in the DRC. And the concrete recommendations to also the religious leaders was precisely to use the Faith for Rights framework and to come together on this human rights-based approach, and really to have concrete activities jointly and diffuse tensions and hate speech in that context. Two more examples very recently. Several special rapporteurs sent a letter to Algeria, which is in the public domain, concerning also blasphemy charges against someone who had also been very vocal and critical. So in that context, both the Rabat Plan of Action on prohibition of incitement to hatred and the Beirut Declaration, notably Commitment 11, was quoted as part of the international soft law standards on that. And the final example, again, very concretely, and going back to gender equality, the European Union in its gender equality plan, gender action plan, last November, explicitly asks their own delegations, so basically their own permanent missions in the field, to engage with religious leaders and faith actors, which in itself is already one additional step, and then explicitly asking the EU External Action Service to use in this engagement the Faith for Rights framework with a specific footnote to explain what this means. And I think this is a wonderful entry point precisely to have human rights-based approaches in engaging with these very important civil society actors.
Excellent. I mean, that would be my last question, like some examples of how this have worked. So in both, like just to complement both what Ibrahim and Michael mentioned, the 18 commitments have been translated by OHCHR, so it's on their website. So if you want to read the 18 commitments in Portuguese, it is available there. I'm sure Sarah can add to the chat. And also in terms of practice, OHCHR has organized together with the University of Oslo some trainings where we implement some of the exercises from the toolkit. And the toolkit is just in English. We have translated a couple of exercises there, a couple of the scenarios, but anyone can use that. And it's, I mean, it's very easy to use, to bring for a youth discussion, for a religious group discussion, among professionals. So anyone can really use that. So I highly recommend. It has been really successful in the trainings I have delivered, both in northern Nigeria and in Brazil. And I really intend to continue implementing that. And that's what we're gonna do in about 10 minutes. So right now, I'm gonna open like for 2 or 3 questions. I don't think we have more time than that. Otherwise, we're not gonna be able to do the exercise. So if you have questions in Portuguese or English, just feel free to, I think you can speak. Sarah, did you receive anything? Rodrigo?
Sorry?
Did you receive any questions?
People may also feel free to just raise their hand and
Yeah.
speak directly, because this way it's an interactive discussion, which is always the best way.
Yeah, just like I saw in English and Spanish already there. So
in this panel. We are going to have a 5-minute break before the next session, a lecture by Professor Mark Hill, QC, and he's already in the room. So thank you, Mark, for joining us for this first panel. And oh, here you are. Very happy to see you. And would you like to say any final words, Michael, Ibrahim, Thiago as well?
Just to say thank you, and I mean, I really enjoyed it. Also, the discussion in our breakout group, And also, I mean, I see in the comment box, for example, the reference to the insects, and Maria in our group.
I think Michael froze.
While Michael is frozen, I just
Okay.
I would complete his sentence by saying that in my group
Of the cockroaches in
felt
the mark again. And I think my connection was lost. So over to Ibrahim.
No, was just saying that to complement what you started to say is that in our group, the importance of contextualization was very high. And to contextualize properly, you need a dialogue. But dialogue cannot be meaningful if it doesn't have a set of standards to inspire it. So those are the three components that came across very clearly from all the interventions. But thank you both, Rodrigo and Thiago, for and all participants for this opportunity to test and learn also through the exchange how people can see these tools and how could they'll be useful in the future work when they have time to zoom at them in a particular context that is of interest to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, Ibrahim, and Thiago as well. Very glad to have this first panel. And as I said, we are having, well, actually, Mark, would you like to say something before we move to the 5-minute break?
No, I'm delighted to be here as part of today's meeting. I was glad I was able to listen to part of the last conversation, but I will keep an element of surprise when I begin my lecture.
All right. All right. So see you all in 5 minutes. You don't have to leave the room. Just close your camera and microphone. And in 5 minutes, we are back. See you soon.